February 14th, 1945. The frozen skies above Tempelhof Airfield, Berlin. Captain Richard Peterson pulled his P-38 Lightning into a climbing turn that should have been impossible at 28,000 feet. Below him, a German Me-262 jet fighter streaked past at 450 miles per hour, its twin Jumo engines leaving contrails that marked the future of aviation. The jet pilot had made a fatal assumption that no propeller-driven fighter could match his speed at altitude. Peterson's crew chief, Technical Sergeant Anthony Martinelli, had spent 3 sleepless nights in a frozen hangar modifying the Supercharger boost controls in ways that Army Air Force's regulations explicitly forbade. The changes he made violated every safety protocol in the technical manual, pushed the Allison engines beyond their designed limits, and could result in catastrophic mechanical failure at any moment. But as Peterson advanced his throttles past the red line into territory that officially did not exist, his Lightning accelerated with authority that defied every performance chart his squadron commander had ever seen. The Me-262 pilot never saw the American fighter closing from above. He had been taught that jet aircraft were untouchable by conventional fighters, that the 200-mile-per-hour speed advantage his revolutionary engines provided made him invulnerable to anything with propellers. German intelligence had briefed Luftwaffe jet pilots that P-38 Lightnings, despite their twin-engine configuration, could not exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight at combat altitudes where thin air robbed piston engines of power. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What those intelligence reports could not account for was a 26-year-old mechanic from South Philadelphia who understood supercharger engineering better than the engineers who designed the systems. Martinelli had learned his craft not in prestigious technical schools, but in the machine shops of his father's automotive repair business, where he had spent his teenage years modifying engines for customers who wanted more power than manufacturers thought safe or practical. The winter of 1944 had brought a new terror to Allied bomber crews flying deep penetration missions over Germany. The Me-262, with its swept-wing design and twin turbojet engines, could approach bomber formations at speeds no conventional fighter could match. American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, despite their excellent performance against propeller-driven German fighters, found themselves helpless against jets that could make attack runs and escape before escort fighters could react. The statistics were becoming unbearable. Of every 10 B-17 flying fortresses that encountered Me-262 seconds over German airspace, 3 would not return. The young men who climbed into those bombers understood that jet fighters represented a quantum leap in aviation technology that made their defensive guns and fighter escorts suddenly obsolete. At bases across England, bomber crews watched the skies with growing dread, knowing that each mission might bring encounters with aircraft that operated under completely different rules of aerial warfare. The P-38 Lightning had entered the war with a reputation for speed and range that made it ideal for long-range escort missions. Its twin Allison V-1710 engines, mounted in distinctive nacelles that gave the aircraft its unmistakable silhouette, could propel it to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight at medium altitudes. But that performance came with significant limitations at the high altitudes where bomber formations operated and jet fighters attacked. Above 25,000 feet, where air density dropped to a fraction of sea-level conditions, the Lightning's supercharged engines struggled to maintain power output. The aircraft's top speed at 30,000 feet rarely exceeded 350 miles per hour, leaving it dangerously slow when attempting to intercept Me-262 seconds that could cruise at over 450 miles per hour at those same altitudes. Worse, the Lightning's complex turbo-supercharger system, while theoretically capable of maintaining power at extreme altitudes, had been deliberately limited by Army Air Force's regulations that prioritized engine reliability over maximum performance. Technical Sergeant Martinelli had arrived at the 364th Fighter Squadron's base in Belgium during December of 1944, assigned to maintain P-38 seconds that were experiencing chronic mechanical problems in the harsh European winter. The Lightning's liquid-cooled Allison engines were particularly vulnerable to cold weather operations, with coolant systems that froze overnight and turbo superchargers that malfunctioned in sub-zero temperatures. Martinelli's first weeks had been consumed with basic maintenance challenges, keeping engines running in conditions that turned routine procedures into exercises in improvisation and mechanical creativity. But as he worked on the aircraft, Martinelli noticed something peculiar about the supercharger control systems. The engines were equipped with mechanical regulators that prevented pilots from advancing boost pressure beyond specific limits, ostensibly to prevent engine damage from overpressurization. These regulators, mandated by technical orders from Wright Field in Ohio, restricted manifold pressure to 54 inches of mercury at war emergency power settings. Martinelli understood supercharger principles well enough to recognize that the Allison engines were mechanically capable of handling significantly higher boost pressures, at least for brief periods. The regulators were conservative safety devices installed because Army engineers assumed that combat pilots would abuse maximum power settings, running engines at destructive pressures for extended periods. But Martinelli also understood that the regulations had been written before jet fighters existed, before anyone imagined American pilots would need to chase aircraft traveling at speeds conventional wisdom said were impossible for combat operations. The idea that would eventually transform P-38 combat effectiveness came to Martinelli during a routine engine inspection in early January of 1945. He was examining the turbo supercharger wastegate controls on Captain Peterson's aircraft when he realized that a relatively simple modification could allow pilots to manually override the boost pressure regulators. The change would give pilots access to emergency power settings well beyond anything the technical manuals acknowledged, potentially increasing engine output by 20 to 30% for short durations. The risks were substantial and undeniable. Operating Allison engines at manifold pressures exceeding 60 inches of mercury could cause detonation, a catastrophic form of premature combustion that would destroy pistons, crack cylinder heads, and potentially cause complete engine failure at altitudes where such failures meant certain death. The higher boost pressures would also increase thermal stress on engine components, potentially leading to bearing failures, exhaust valve damage, and turbo supercharger failures that could leave pilots stranded hundreds of miles from friendly territory. Martinelli knew that implementing his modification without authorization could result in court-martial if the changes led to aircraft losses or pilot deaths. But he also understood the tactical situation facing his squadron. American bomber crews were dying because escort fighters could not protect them against jet interceptors that operated with impunity. The regulations that restricted P-38 performance had been written for a different war, before anyone understood that aerial combat would involve trying to catch aircraft traveling at speeds that made conventional fighter tactics obsolete. Captain Peterson had been flying P-38 seconds since 1943, accumulating over 400 combat hours during campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and France. He had survived 3 years of aerial warfare by developing an instinctive understanding of his aircraft's capabilities and limitations. He knew exactly how fast his Lightning could fly at any altitude, how long his engines would run at maximum power before overheating became critical, and which combat maneuvers were possible within the aircraft's performance envelope. When Martinelli approached Peterson in the squadron's operations tent on the evening of January 18th, the mechanic's proposal seemed to violate everything Peterson understood about engine limitations and mechanical reliability. Martinelli explained that he could modify the supercharger, controls to allow boost pressures up to 65 inches of mercury, potentially increasing top speed by 50 miles per hour at high altitude. But he was honest about the risks, acknowledging that such modifications could destroy engines within minutes if not managed carefully. Peterson's initial reaction was skepticism bordering on dismissal. Army regulations existed for reasons, typically because someone had already tried whatever was being proposed and experienced catastrophic results. The technical orders restricting supercharger boost came from engineers at Wright Field who understood Allison engines better than any mechanic working in field conditions. Ignoring those limitations seemed like asking for mechanical failure at the worst possible moment. But Peterson had also watched Me-262 seconds make attack runs on bomber formations his squadron was supposed to protect, helpless to intervene because his aircraft simply could not reach the jet fighters before they completed their attacks and accelerated away. The frustration of flying escort missions, knowing that enemy fighters could operate with impunity, was eating away at every pilot in the squadron. If Martinelli's modification offered even a possibility of intercepting jets, the risk might be worth taking. The decision was complicated by chain-of-command considerations that made unauthorized mechanical modifications potentially career-ending. Major William Larson, commanding the 364th Fighter Squadron, was a by-the-book officer who insisted on strict adherence to technical orders and maintenance procedures. Larson had been an airline pilot before the war, trained to follow checklists and regulations with absolute precision. The idea of allowing mechanics to modify engine controls without engineering approval would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Peterson understood that if he wanted to test Martinelli's modification, he would need to do so without informing squadron, the command, until results proved the concept viable. This meant accepting personal responsibility for any consequences, including potential court-martial, if the modification caused an aircraft accident or if higher command decided that violating technical orders warranted disciplinary action regardless of tactical results. The first modification took place during the night of January 20th in a maintenance hangar that smelled of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the bitter cold that made metal tools painful to touch with bare hands. Martinelli worked by the dim light of work lamps powered by a portable generator, carefully adjusting the mechanical linkages that connected throttle controls to turbo-supercharger wastegate actuators. The changes he made were subtle but significant, installing bypass mechanisms that would allow pilots to override the automatic boost pressure regulators during emergency situations. The technical complexity of the modification reflected Martinelli's deep understanding of supercharger systems. The Allison engines used turbo-superchargers that captured exhaust gas energy to drive compressor wheels that forced additional air into engine cylinders. This forced induction allowed the engines to maintain sea-level power output at altitudes where atmospheric pressure would normally starve the engine of oxygen. But the system required careful regulation to prevent overpressurization that could cause engine damage. Martinelli's modification essentially removed the safety governors that prevented pilots from demanding more boost pressure than engineers considered safe. He installed a secondary control circuit that bypassed the automatic regulators, giving pilots direct control over wastegate position and therefore boost pressure. The system included a lockout switch that prevented accidental engagement, ensuring that pilots would only access the forbidden power settings through deliberate action. By dawn on January 21st, Martinelli had completed the installation and conducted ground tests that confirmed the modified controls functioned as designed. The engine ran smoothly at standard boost pressures, and when Martinelli carefully tested the override system with the aircraft secured to the flight line, manifold pressure gauges registered 63 inches of mercury, well beyond the 54-inch limit mandated by technical orders. The Allison engines produced a deeper, more aggressive sound at the elevated boost pressures, a mechanical growl that suggested raw power waiting to be unleashed. Peterson conducted his first test flight on the afternoon of January 21st, departing from the squadron's base under the pretense of routine patrol operations. He climbed to 25,000 feet over Allied-controlled territory before attempting to engage the modified supercharger controls. The procedure Martinelli had designed required deliberate action, preventing accidental engagement during normal operations. Peterson had to flip a safety switch, pull a secondary throttle override, and manually adjust the wastegate controls to access the forbidden boost pressures. The engine response was immediate and dramatic. As manifold pressure climbed past the regulation limits, Peterson felt acceleration that his Lightning had never delivered at high altitude. The airspeed indicator registered 380 miles per hour in level flight at 25,000 feet, speeds that should have been impossible at that altitude with standard engine settings. More importantly, the aircraft continued accelerating, suggesting that even higher speeds might be achievable at maximum boost. Peterson climbed to 30,000 feet to test high-altitude performance, where the modification's impact would be most significant. At that altitude, where thin air normally choked engine power, engaging Martinelli's override system produced results that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The Lightning accelerated to 420 miles per hour in level flight, speeds that exceeded every performance chart in Peterson's flight manual by margins that could not be explained through measurement error or favorable atmospheric conditions. The critical question was engine durability. Peterson monitored cylinder head temperatures and oil pressures with obsessive attention, watching for any indication that the elevated boost pressures were causing mechanical damage. After 10 minutes at maximum boost, the temperatures had increased to levels near but not exceeding operational limits. The Allison engines, despite being pushed well beyond their designed parameters, appeared capable of sustaining the abuse without immediate failure. Peterson's after-action report, filed through informal channels to avoid alerting squadron command, described performance improvements that seemed almost fictional. The modified Lightning had achieved speeds 50 to 60 miles per hour faster than standard aircraft at altitudes above 25,000 feet. More significantly, the acceleration and climbing performance at high altitude had improved dramatically, potentially allowing P-38 seconds to intercept jet fighters that had previously been untouchable. Within 48 hours, Martinelli had modified 3 additional P-38 seconds, working through long nights to install the bypass systems before squadron leadership could discover and potentially shut down the unauthorized program. Each aircraft received the same careful modifications, with Martinelli personally testing every installation to ensure consistent performance across the flight. The pilots selected for the modified aircraft were experienced veterans who understood the risks and possessed the judgment to use the extra power judiciously rather than recklessly. The first combat test came on January 27th, when Peterson's flight encountered an Me-262, making an attack run on a formation of B-17 seconds flying over Western Germany. The engagement began with tactical geometry that heavily favored the jet, which approached the bomber formation from high altitude with a speed advantage that should have made interception impossible. Peterson's 4 P-38 seconds were escorting the bombers at 28,000 feet, positioned to defend against conventional fighters, but seemingly helpless against jets operating at speeds beyond their reach. Peterson engaged Martinelli's override system the moment he identified the approaching Me-262, feeling the familiar surge of power as boost pressures climbed into forbidden territory. His Lightning accelerated with authority that surprised even him, closing the distance to the jet fighter with speed that German pilots had been assured was impossible for propeller-driven aircraft. At 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, Peterson was flying faster than any P-38 pilot had ever flown at that altitude, pushing his aircraft into performance regimes that existed only because a Philadelphia mechanic understood supercharger engineering better than the people who wrote the regulations. The Me-262 pilot, focused on lining up his attack on the bomber formation, never detected the P-38 closing from his high 6 o'clock position. German intelligence had briefed jet pilots that conventional fighters were too slow to threaten them during attack runs, that they could make their passes and escape before Allied escorts could react. That intelligence was based on performance data for standard P-38 seconds, not modified aircraft burning through their engines' safety margins to achieve speeds that officially did not exist. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Peterson opened fire from 400 yards, his concentrated nose armament of one 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns converging on the jet fighter's fuselage. The Me-262, despite its revolutionary engines and swept-wing design, proved just as vulnerable to gunfire as conventional aircraft. Armor plating protected critical systems, but the airframe itself could not withstand the concentrated fire from 5 weapons hitting simultaneously. The jet fighter's right engine erupted in flames as Peterson's rounds tore through the turbine housing, sending fragments of exotic metal alloys spinning through the frozen air. The Me-262 pilot, Lieutenant Klaus Fischer, experienced the shock of technological superiority suddenly reversed. He had been flying missions against Allied bombers for 3 weeks, confident that his jet's speed made him untouchable by conventional fighters. The realization that he was burning at 30,000 feet, shot down by a propeller-driven aircraft, contradicted everything German aviation had promised about jet invincibility. Fischer managed to bail out before his damaged Me-262 entered an unrecoverable spin, but his parachute descent through Allied-controlled airspace meant immediate capture. When intelligence officers interrogated him at a processing center in Belgium, Fischer insisted that he had been attacked by a new type of American fighter, something faster than standard P-38 seconds. The interrogators dismissed his claims as confusion or deliberate misinformation, filing reports that described another jet loss to conventional fighters, without understanding that they were documenting the first combat success of an unauthorized mechanical modification that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force's Technical Library. Peterson's squadron mates who witnessed the engagement radioed excited reports that their flight leader had just accomplished what everyone said was impossible. The P-38 that had caught and shot down an Me-262 inches level flight at 30,000 feet was flying using performance that exceeded official specifications by margins that suggested either equipment malfunction or measurement error. But the other pilots, equipped with Martinelli's modification, confirmed similar performance improvements, describing acceleration and top speeds that transformed their Lightnings from adequate escort fighters into interceptors capable of challenging even jet aircraft. Major Larsen's reaction to learning about the unauthorized modifications oscillated between fury at the violation of regulations and grudging recognition that his squadron had just achieved something unprecedented. Martinelli had modified 4 aircraft without authorization, exposing pilots to unknown mechanical risks while potentially invalidating maintenance certifications and flight safety protocols. But those same modifications had enabled the first confirmed kill of an Me-262 by a P-38, demonstrating combat effectiveness that might save bomber crews from jet attacks. The confrontation between Larsen and Martinelli took place in the squadron commander's office on the evening of January 27th, with Peterson present to take responsibility for authorizing the test flights. Larsen demanded detailed technical explanations for the modifications, insisting that Martinelli document exactly what changes had been made and what risks they created. The mechanic's explanation, delivered in the straightforward language of someone who understood engines better than military protocols, acknowledged that the boost pressure overrides could cause catastrophic failures if misused, but argued that the tactical advantages justified carefully managed risks. Peterson supported Martinelli's position by describing the combat engagement in detail, emphasizing that without the modification, he would have been unable to intercept the Me-262. The jet fighter had been approaching at speeds his standard P-38 could not match, positioning for an attack run that would have destroyed at least 2 B-17 seconds. The modified Supercharger controls had given Peterson the speed necessary to close within firing range before the jet completed its attack, directly saving American lives through mechanical modifications that official regulations prohibited. Larsen faced an impossible decision. Reporting the unauthorized modifications to higher command might result in courts-martial for both Martinelli and Peterson, while also forcing removal of the modifications from aircraft that had demonstrated genuine tactical advantages. But endorsing the modifications without proper engineering evaluation could expose the squadron to liability if the boost pressure overrides caused accidents or mechanical failures. The compromise he reached reflected pragmatic recognition that combat effectiveness sometimes required operating outside peacetime regulations. The squadron would continue using the modified aircraft, while Larsen filed reports through intelligence channels rather than maintenance channels, describing improved P-38 performance against jet fighters without explicitly acknowledging mechanical modifications. This approach allowed higher command to benefit from the tactical advantages while maintaining plausible deniability about regulation violations. Martinelli would document the modifications thoroughly, but file the documentation as classified technical intelligence rather than maintenance records, protecting him from immediate disciplinary action while creating a paper trail that might eventually lead to official authorization. The approach worked because it served everyone's interests. Squadron pilots gained access to performance they needed to protect bomber formations. Higher command could claim success against jet fighters without acknowledging that success required violating their own technical orders. And Martinelli could continue refining his modifications, expanding the program to additional aircraft while gathering performance data that might eventually persuade engineering authorities at Wright Field to revise the overly conservative boost pressure limitations. By early February of 1945, 12 P-38 seconds in the 364th Fighter Squadron were equipped with Martinelli's Supercharger modifications. The program expanded through informal networks as mechanics from other squadrons learned about the performance improvements and requested technical details. Martinelli found himself conducting clandestine training sessions, teaching other crew chiefs how to install the bypass systems while emphasizing the importance of pilot discipline in managing the extra power. The tactical transformation extended beyond individual aircraft performance to reshape squadron combat doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Hayes, commanding the 361st Fighter Group, developed new tactical procedures specifically for modified P-38 seconds engaging jet fighters. The procedures recognized that even with Martinelli's modifications, Lightnings could not sustain maximum boost pressures indefinitely without risking mechanical failure. Hayes's doctrine emphasized careful energy management, using the extra power in short bursts during critical phases of combat rather than continuous high-speed operations. The training emphasized recognition of engine warning signs that indicated approaching mechanical limits. Pilots learned to monitor cylinder head temperatures with obsessive attention, watching for temperature spikes that suggested detonation was imminent. They practiced emergency procedures for engine failures at high altitude, preparing for scenarios where pushing engines beyond design limits might result in complete power loss hundreds of miles from friendly territory. The training acknowledged risks that official documentation would never mention, creating an informal knowledge base that existed outside normal military record-keeping. First Lieutenant James Morrison, a relative newcomer to the squadron with only 40 combat hours, experienced the psychological impact of the modifications during his first engagement with jet fighters on February 7th. Morrison had been briefed extensively on the boost pressure override procedures, understanding theoretically how to engage the system and what performance improvements to expect. But theory provided inadequate preparation for the reality of flying at speeds that exceeded everything his training had taught him was possible in a P-38. Morrison's encounter began when his flight intercepted 3 Mi-262 seconds, attacking a formation of B-24 Liberators over central Germany. The jets approached with the tactical confidence that came from months of operating against fighters that could not match their speed. Morrison engaged the Supercharger override as briefed, feeling his lightning surge forward with acceleration that pressed him back into his seat. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour at 29,000 feet, speeds that should have been impossible at that altitude. But Morrison made the critical error that Martinelli and Peterson had warned against. He maintained maximum boost pressure for over 5 minutes, focused entirely on closing with the lead Mi-262, while ignoring the cylinder head temperature gauges that were climbing into dangerous territory. The first indication of trouble came when his right engine began running rough, producing vibrations that shook the entire airframe. Morrison immediately reduced boost pressure and throttled back. But the damage had been done. The engine continued deteriorating, losing power as internal components that had been stressed beyond their limits began failing. Morrison managed to shoot down one Me-262 before his damaged engine forced him to break off the engagement and head for friendly territory. He nursed the crippled Lightning back to Belgium, but the engine failure during approach resulted in a crash landing that destroyed the aircraft while Morrison escaped with only minor injuries. The incident provided exactly the kind of evidence that critics of unauthorized modifications needed to demand program termination. Morrison had pushed his engine too hard for too long, ignoring temperature warnings in the heat of combat and suffering mechanical failure that could easily have killed him over enemy territory. Major Larson faced renewed pressure from Group Command to remove all modifications and return to standard configurations, with engineering officers arguing that Morrison's experience proved the dangers of allowing pilots access to boost pressures beyond regulation limits. But the tactical results spoke louder than the risks. During the 2 weeks since Peterson's initial combat success, modified P-38 seconds had engaged Me-262 seconds on 7 separate occasions, shooting down 4 jets while losing only Morrison's aircraft to mechanical failure rather than enemy action. The kill ratio, combined with the reality that standard P-38 seconds had virtually no capability against jets, provided compelling justification for continuing the program despite its irregular origins and documented risks. The intelligence reaching Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin during February painted an increasingly disturbing picture of American fighter capabilities. German pilots were filing combat reports describing P-38 Lightnings performing at speeds German engineering analysis insisted were impossible for that aircraft type. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces now flying Me-262 seconds, personally debriefed pilots who claimed they had been intercepted by P-38 seconds, traveling at over 420 miles per hour at altitudes above 28,000 feet. German aviation engineers subjected the reports to detailed analysis, comparing claimed American performance against known specifications for P-38 aircraft. The Allison engines powering the Lightning were thoroughly documented in German intelligence files, with performance data that clearly showed the aircraft's top speed at 30,000 feet could not exceed 360 miles per hour under standard conditions. The reports of higher speeds were initially dismissed as pilot error or altitude measurement mistakes, explanations that allowed German command to maintain their understanding of Allied fighter capabilities. But the pattern of reports became impossible to ignore, as more Me-262 pilots described encounters with unusually fast P-38 seconds. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding Jagdverband 44, ordered his pilots to avoid engagement with P-38 seconds unless tactical conditions provided overwhelming advantages. The directive represented extraordinary acknowledgement that propeller-driven American fighters had somehow achieved performance that threatened Germany's most advanced aircraft, though the mechanism for that performance improvement remained mysterious to Luftwaffe intelligence analysts. The reality of American Supercharger modifications never appeared in German intelligence assessments because the concept seemed too crude to warrant serious consideration. German aviation engineering emphasized sophisticated technical solutions, complex mechanical systems that pushed the boundaries of metallurgy and precision manufacturing. The idea that American mechanics were achieving performance improvements through simple modifications to boost pressure controls seemed too unsophisticated to explain the performance gains German pilots were reporting. This blindness to simple solutions reflected broader assumptions about American technical capabilities that had plagued German intelligence throughout the war. Luftwaffe analysts consistently underestimated American engineering pragmatism, expecting that performance improvements would come through revolutionary new aircraft designs rather than incremental modifications to existing systems. The assumption that American technology was fundamentally inferior to German engineering prevented serious analysis of how mechanics working in field conditions might achieve results that factory engineers had not anticipated. The strategic impact of Martinelli's modifications extended far beyond the relatively small number of modified aircraft. The psychological effect on Me-262 pilots of losing jet fighters to P-38 seconds fundamentally altered German tactical planning for jet operations. Jagdverband commanders who had previously authorized aggressive attacks on bomber formations began emphasizing caution and defensive tactics, concerned that American fighters possessed capabilities that German intelligence had not documented. This tactical conservatism reduced Mi-262 effectiveness precisely when Luftwaffe needed maximum impact from their limited jet fighter resources. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under sustained Allied bombing, making replacement of lost jets increasingly difficult. Every Mi-262 destroyed in combat represented resources that could not be replaced, while American aircraft losses were made good through production that seemed limitless to German observers. The kill ratios that favored American fighters, even by small margins, translated into strategic advantages that compounded over time. Captain Richard Peterson flew his final combat mission on March 23, 1945, leading a flight of modified P-38 seconds escorting B-17 seconds attacking synthetic fuel plants near Leipzig. The mission profile called for deep penetration into German airspace at altitudes where jet interceptors had previously operated with near impunity. Peterson's flight encountered 6 Mi-262 seconds, positioning for attack runs on the bomber formation, setting up the largest engagement yet between modified P-38 seconds and German jets. The dogfight that followed demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of Martinelli's modifications. Peterson's Lightnings could match Mi-262 speeds during brief periods when pilots engaged the boost pressure overrides, allowing them to close within firing range and force the jets in defensive maneuvering. But sustained high-speed combat stressed the Allison engines to their absolute limits, with cylinder head temperatures climbing into ranges that made catastrophic failure increasingly likely with each passing minute. Peterson himself experienced engine trouble during the engagement when his left engine began showing dangerous temperature spikes that indicated detonation was beginning to occur. He immediately reduced boost pressure and throttled back, but not before shooting down one Mi-262 and damaging another sufficiently that it was forced to break off its attack run. The tactical victory came at significant mechanical cost, with Peterson's left engine requiring complete overhaul after the mission due to piston and valve damage caused by sustained operation at excessive boost pressures. The engagement over Leipzig provided the data that finally convinced Army Air Forces Engineering Command to conduct official evaluation of the Supercharger modifications. 3 modified P-38 seconds were flown to Wright Field in Ohio during early April for comprehensive testing by engineers who had written the original boost pressure limitations. The testing revealed that Martinelli's modifications, while crude by engineering standards, were fundamentally sound in their understanding of what Allison engines could sustain during emergency operations. The Wright Field analysis concluded that the standard boost pressure limitations had indeed been overly conservative, established during peacetime development, when engine longevity was prioritized over maximum performance. Combat conditions, where engines might need to produce maximum power for brief periods, even at the cost of shortened service life, justified higher boost pressures than the regulations allowed. The official recommendation proposed revising technical orders to permit manifold pressures up to 60 inches of mercury under specific combat conditions, essentially legalizing much of what Martinelli had been doing through unauthorized modifications. But the formal approval process moved with bureaucratic slowness that made it largely irrelevant to actual combat operations. By the time revised technical orders reached operational squadrons in late April of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final weeks. German jet fighter operations had collapsed along with the infrastructure necessary to produce and maintain the advanced aircraft. The Mi-262 seconds that had terrorized Allied bomber formations just months earlier were grounded by fuel shortages, parts unavailability, and the systematic destruction of airfields capable of supporting jet operations. Technical Sergeant Martinelli received official recognition for his innovations in a ceremony conducted at the squadron's base in Belgium on May 2nd, just days before Germany's surrender. Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, personally presented Martinelli with the Legion of Merit, citing his technical innovations that had improved fighter effectiveness against jet aircraft. The citation carefully avoided mentioning that Martinelli's innovations had violated regulations, instead emphasizing the tactical results and his dedication to supporting combat operations. The human cost of pushing engines beyond their designed limits became apparent during the final accounting after the war ended. Of the 43 P-38 seconds modified with Martinelli's Supercharger overrides, 17 had experienced significant engine damage requiring major overhaul or complete engine replacement. 3 aircraft had suffered catastrophic engine failures during combat operations, though only one resulted in pilot death when Lieutenant Robert Hayes was unable to bail out after dual-engine failure over Germany in mid-April. The casualty figures were sobering but had to be weighed against the alternative. Modified P-38 seconds had engaged Me-262 seconds on 27 documented occasions, shooting down 14 jets while losing 4 aircraft to all causes, including mechanical failure. Standard P-38 seconds flying similar escort missions had engaged jets on over 40 occasions, with only 2 confirmed kills and 12 aircraft lost. The statistical advantage of the modifications was clear, though the human price paid through increased mechanical failures remained a source of controversy in post-war analysis. Captain Peterson survived the war with 16 confirmed kills, including 4 Me-262 seconds, making him one of the few American pilots to achieve ace status against jet aircraft. His post-war career took him to the Air Force Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base in California, where his combat experience with modified engines informed development of performance enhancement programs for jet fighters. Peterson understood viscerally that combat effectiveness sometimes required operating equipment beyond conservative safety margins, lessons that influenced his approach to test flying and performance evaluation. The legacy of Martinelli's modifications extended far beyond their immediate tactical impact. The right field analysis of the Supercharger overrides led to comprehensive revision of engine operating limitations across the entire Army Air Force's inventory. Engineers recognized that peacetime development had produced overly conservative restrictions that limited combat effectiveness without providing proportional improvements in reliability or safety. The new technical orders, implemented during the early Cold War period, gave pilots greater latitude to use emergency power settings while providing better guidance on managing the associated risks. The philosophical implications proved even more significant than the technical changes. Martinelli's success demonstrated that field modifications by experienced mechanics could produce innovations that escaped factory engineers and development laboratories. The Army Air Forces, and later the independent United States Air Force, established formal programs to collect and evaluate field modifications, recognizing that combat experience often revealed performance opportunities that peacetime testing missed. Technical Sergeant Anthony Martinelli remained in the Air Force after the war, retiring in 1963 as a Chief Master Sergeant with a career that spanned the transition from propeller fighters to supersonic jets. His final assignment was at the Air Force Systems Command, where he served as Senior Enlisted Advisor for engine development programs. The mechanics and engineers who worked with him during those years often heard stories about the unauthorized Supercharger modifications in Belgium, tales that emphasized practical problem-solving over rigid adherence to regulations. The P-38 Lightning itself became obsolete within months of the war's end, replaced by jet fighters that made propeller-driven aircraft irrelevant for air superiority missions. The last operational P-38 seconds were retired from active service in 1949, with most examples scrapped or sold as surplus. But the performance data from Martinelli's modifications survived in engineering archives, providing reference points for understanding how much performance could be extracted from piston engines when tactical necessity justified accepting increased mechanical risks. Lieutenant Klaus Fischer, the Me-262 pilot shot down by Peterson during the first combat test of the modifications, spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp in England before returning to Germany in 1946. Fischer eventually became an aeronautical engineer, working on civil aviation projects during Germany's post-war reconstruction. In a 1978 interview, Fisher acknowledged that being shot down by a P-38 had shattered his confidence in jet invincibility, describing the psychological impact of discovering that American fighters possessed capabilities German intelligence had insisted were impossible. The broader strategic lessons from the Supercharger modification program influenced Cold War military development policies. American defense establishment recognized that technological superiority could emerge from unexpected sources, that mechanics working in combat conditions might develop innovations that laboratory engineers never considered. This understanding informed decisions to maintain close connections between operational units and development commands, ensuring that field experience informed equipment, design, and modification programs. The irony of Martinelli's achievement was that it required violations of regulations that existed for legitimate safety reasons. The boost pressure limitations he bypassed had been established to prevent exactly the kind of engine damage that his modifications sometimes caused. But combat created different calculus, where accepting mechanical risks became justifiable, if doing so provided tactical advantages that saved lives or achieved strategic objectives. This tension between peacetime safety culture and wartime operational necessity would remain unresolved throughout subsequent conflicts. The final assessment of the Supercharger modification program came from an unexpected source, decades after the war ended. In 1987, the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum acquired one of the few surviving P-38 seconds that had been modified with Martinelli's Supercharger overrides. The aircraft, recovered from a private collector in Montana, retained its modified boost pressure controls and provided physical evidence of field modifications that had existed largely in oral histories and classified documents. Engineers examining the installation were struck by its elegant simplicity. Martinelli had achieved significant performance improvements through modifications that required no exotic materials, no revolutionary new technologies, just careful rethinking how existing systems could be operated outside their designed parameters. The installation demonstrated practical engineering at its finest, solving complex problems through direct mechanical interventions that anyone with adequate understanding of Supercharger principles could have implemented. The museum's restoration team faced an ethical question about whether to preserve Martinelli's modifications or return the aircraft to standard configuration. The decision to maintain the modifications reflected recognition that they represented historically significant innovation, physical evidence of how combat necessity drove technical adaptation during World War II. The preserved P-38 serves as testament to anonymous mechanics whose innovations shaped military aviation, despite never appearing in official development programs or receiving formal engineering credit. The story of Technical Sergeant Anthony Martinelli and his forbidden Supercharger modifications illuminates aspects of military innovation that formal histories often overlook. The decisive technological advantages that determined combat outcomes sometimes emerged not from prestigious laboratories or well-funded development programs, but from mechanics working in frozen hangars, who understood that regulations written for peacetime operations might not serve wartime necessities. The young sergeant from South Philadelphia, who modified P-38 Supercharger controls, never claimed to have revolutionized aviation or changed the course of the war. His innovations were tactical rather than strategic, providing performance improvements that mattered in specific combat situations without fundamentally altering the broader trajectory of Allied victory. But for the bomber crews who survived because modified P-38 seconds could intercept jet fighters, and for the pilots who gained confidence from flying aircraft that could challenge Germany's most advanced weapons, Martinelli's work represented the difference between helplessness and capability. The forbidden boost pressures that Army regulations prohibited and that cautious engineers warned against became instruments of survival for pilots flying into German airspace during the war's final months. The extra 50 miles per hour at high altitude, purchased through mechanical risks that violated every safety protocol, transformed inadequate escort fighters into interceptors capable of protecting the vulnerable bombers they were assigned to defend. One mechanic's understanding that regulations could be bent when circumstances justified the bending had saved lives through innovations that official channels would never have approved. The silence that descended over European airfields in May of 1945 carried within it the knowledge that victory had emerged from countless small innovations, unofficial modifications, and practical solutions that existed outside formal documentation. Martinelli's Supercharger overrides represented one thread in the complex fabric of Allied technological superiority, a reminder that wars are won not just through grand strategies and revolutionary weapons, but through the accumulated advantages of mechanics who understand their equipment well enough to make it perform beyond what anyone thought possible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.